Imagine this, a morning in London. You're a typical urban intellectual or financier. The Times is spread out on the table, the tea has gone cold, the whiskey is still warm, a cigar is smoldering in the ashtray. You put on a perfectly tailored suit, step outside, and expect to see the London written about by Conan Doyle and Dickens. Restrained, angular, a little austere, but instantly recognizable. A city of gentlemen, cabs, brick facades, and cool dignity. But you see something else. Women in dark garments concealing their faces, men in long white robes with beards that simply did not exist in this neighborhood 30 years ago, shops with signs in a foreign language, and in front of you, a large mosque, from which several times a day a voice carries across the area, calling to prayer. Not church bells, not background street noise, but a direct declaration of faith, audible to everyone around. Congratulations. You haven't moved and you haven't crossed continents. You're still in London. It's just that this is modern London. A city changing not according to books or postcards, but according to demography, migration, and quiet decisions made many years ago. And today, the question is not whether you like this or not. The real question is different. When exactly did the city you thought was yours become something else? And did you even notice the moment it happened? To answer, when London became different, we need to register reality briefly and clearly, without emotions and without excuses. The United Kingdom is experiencing not just migration and not just cultural change. We are talking about a demographic shift whose consequences will shape the country not for decades, but for generations. According to official data, in 2011 there were around 2.7 million Muslims living in the country. By 2021, that number had risen to almost 4 million. That is more than 6.5% of the population. According to projections by research centers, by the middle of the century, the Muslim share of the UK population could reach 15 to 20%. This is not an extreme migration scenario, but a moderate model, based on current birth rates, migration flows, and age structure. And here the first worrying point appears. Growth is not evenly distributed. According to statistical agencies, the Muslim population is the fastest growing demographic group in the country. The native population is aging and shrinking. The average age is higher. Fertility is below replacement level. Among newcomers, the picture is the opposite. Higher female fertility, a much younger age pyramid, large numbers of children and teenagers. This means that even without new waves of migration, the balance will shift automatically. The second point is spatial. Growth is concentrated not across the entire country, but in specific cities and districts. London, Birmingham, Bradford, Luton, parts of Manchester. Areas are forming where English culture is no longer dominant. Even Nigel Farage speaks openly about this, stressing that in certain neighborhoods, England is no longer there. Not in a legal sense, but in everyday life. Different communities live there, by different rules, with different social norms. The English gentleman written about by the classics genuinely cannot be found there. The third aspect is religious infrastructure. The number of mosques in the country is steadily increasing. There are now more than 1,500. At the same time, Christian churches are closing, losing congregations, and increasingly being sold or repurposed. This is not a metaphor and not a culture war, but dry statistics. The country's religious landscape is changing before our eyes, and it is doing so faster than society has time to reflect on the consequences. And finally, social reality. Areas are emerging where people are advised not to go. Not officially, not in writing, but locals know, services know, taxi drivers know. This is always the first symptom of parallel spaces, where the state's presence formally exists but is effectively weakened. Now to the most sensitive, and at the same time the most revealing and point. Contrary to official rhetoric, a significant share of migrants does not strive to integrate into British culture, not because they cannot or do not understand, but because they do not see the need to. Their system of reference points is already established. Religious and communal identity matters more to them than secular norms and British traditions. British law is acknowledged conditionally, while real guidelines are found within their own environment. Of course, not everyone behaves this way, but the key issue is different. A sufficiently large proportion is enough to change the surrounding environment. This is where the crucial moment arises. In the absence of strict and mandatory integration mechanisms, newcomers begin to act differently, not through conflict and not through direct pressure, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, like in a strategic game. First, the map of what is permitted is studied. Then, step by step, the space expands in which not local rules apply, but their own. First in everyday life, then in the social sphere, then in institutions. The first mechanism is diasporas and a strong sense of community. People stick together, forming dense social networks through which housing, jobs, healthcare, education, and disputes are handled. This creates parallel infrastructure that reduces dependence on the state while strengthening internal loyalty. Then comes the next stage, promoting their own into grassroots structures. Local administrations, schools, hospitals, social services, the police, not for abstract representation, but for control over processes and access to information. Over time, these connections move higher up. Lawyers appear, officials, judicial assistants, party activists. Formally, this is a normal career path in an open society. In practice, it is the formation of a vertical of influence where the key factor becomes belonging to a community rather than universal rules. All of this is usually usually called lobbying, but in essence, it is biased participation in politics in the interests of a specific group, often at the expense of the majority. In any other context, this would be called a conflict of interests. The second mechanism is political mobilization. Imagine that you are an informal leader of a diaspora with influence over tens of thousands of votes. In a democracy, this is an enormous resource. Politicians understand this perfectly. Negotiations begin. Electoral support in exchange for appointments, funding, and turning a blind eye to sensitive issues. The formula is simple. We deliver the votes. You secure positions for us. Appointed representatives then push decisions beneficial to the community, from education programs to cadre policy and budget allocation. It is important to stress, this is not a conspiracy and not a secret plan, at least at this stage of the argument. It is rational behavior within a system that does not demand assimilation but rewards group mobilization. The problem is not that minorities participate in politics. The problem is that integration is replaced by institutional capture and social consensus by bargaining between groups. This is where the fracture emerges. When rules begin to work selectively and norms start to depend on numbers and organization, the state gradually loses its universality. It stops being common to everyone and turns into a field of competition between identities. And this process no longer looks like multiculturalism. It looks much more like the quiet dismantling of a shared space where each group expands its zone of influence, for as long as it is allowed to do so. Now comes the key question. Who is behind this? Formally, the answer lies on the surface. It is politicians and party machines that have discovered a convenient and fast technology for staying in power. When support from the native population declines, when voters are tired, disillusioned, and no longer believe promises, a simple solution appears. Expand the electorate by bringing in new groups, bring in foreigners, legalize them, provide benefits, housing, access to social services, and receive loyalty in return. In a democracy, this works almost flawlessly. A person whose well-being directly depends on the state votes for those who guarantee the preservation of that system. This is not ideology. It is pragmatism. For political parties, this is an ideal mechanism. It is faster than economic reform, cheaper than rebuilding trust, more reliable than working with a native electorate that asks uncomfortable questions. This is how artificial political continuity is created. You create a new electorate, and it votes for you because any alternative is perceived as dangerous. Any attempt to change the rules looks like a threat to their way of life. Now let's talk about those who almost never appear on camera, but profit from what is happening more than anyone else. The financial elite, banks, property developers, investment funds, infrastructure contractors. For them, mass migration is not a humanitarian issue. It is a stable market. Every new influx of people creates explosive demand for housing. The state subsidizes rent or commissions construction. Developers receive guaranteed income. Dense building, minimal standards, rapid turnover. Prices rise, shortages are maintained artificially. And in the end, the cost is borne by the native population and the public budget. There are no losers in this scheme, except society itself. The next layer is banks. Population growth means growth in borrowing. Mortgages, municipal loans, financing for schools, hospitals, transport. The state sinks ever deeper into debt, while banks collect interest with minimal risk. The greater the social burden, the higher their profit. This is not a malfunction of the system. It is how the system is designed to work. Infrastructure and integration programs are another source of money. Language courses, adaptation centers, social services, NGOs. These projects exist for years and produce no results, which is precisely why they continue to be funded. Failed integration becomes a source of income, not a reason to change anything. Then there is the labor market. Mass migration creates an oversupply of cheap labor. Wages are pushed down, trade unions weaken, and competition shifts from quality of life to sheer survival. Big business benefits, while social tension grows. The key point must be understood clearly. Financial groups are not interested in real integration. An integrated person demands equal rights and decent pay. Someone dependent, living on subsidies and low-paid work, is economically more profitable. Now we can draw an interesting interim conclusion. Political elites get a manageable electorate. Big business gets cheap and disciplined labor. Financial and property interests get demand for housing and infrastructure. States plug demographic gaps without reforming family policy or birth rates. Migrants receive protection, benefits, and the ability to live by their own rules. Every element of the system wins. In the short term, only one thing loses: social cohesion, and it has no lobbyists. Now we move to the main point. There is a factor that cannot be ignored. The United Kingdom is not unique. Exactly the same processes, absolutely identical, can be observed in Germany, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, the United States. Even in countries with completely different histories, economies, and political cultures, the mechanism works the same way. Mass migration, social guarantees, diasporas, the absence of strict integration, the growth of parallel communities, followed by political representation and influence. A coincidence? Perhaps. But when the same scenario repeats itself in different countries, a logical question arises. Why do the same decisions everywhere produce the same results? And no one corrects the course. One more detail is important. The main pressure falls on countries with a Christian cultural foundation. It is precisely these societies that show the greatest vulnerability to migration waves and to identity transformation, not because they are weaker, but because their social model is built on individual rights, humanism, secularism, and the rejection of strict demands for cultural assimilation. This creates an open space that is easy to enter and very difficult to fence in with hard limits. And now, if all these processes are taking place across the world in Christian societies, it is logical to assume that this process has architects. After the publication of the Epstein files, many theories stopped looking absurd, not because they provide direct answers, but because it became obvious that someone is capable of acting in their own interests for decades, hiding behind humanitarian rhetoric while remaining outside public control. What used to be dismissed as conspiracy theory increasingly turns out to be reality. That is why the main question today is not who is to blame. The main question is what to do about it. It seems likely that we are on the threshold of serious change, and possibly major political changes.